Justice Barrett?
I'm going to ask you about irreparable harm. You were just talking to Justice Kavanaugh about the uniqueness of the Fed and its need for independence. And the government, because it has not challenged the removal restriction, for purposes of this case, I think we're all operating on that assumption. When the president, if you're thinking about the unitary executive, when the president has untrammeled authority to fire a subordinate, keeping that subordinate in office, I think, inflicts maybe a different kind of irreparable harm than the argument that the government would be able to make here, because the president doesn't have the same control over the Fed, at least based on the assumptions we have in this case. What do you think about that? And what kind of an argument would you make for, what is your best case argument that the president is not suffering irreparable harm by the inability? Let's assume that he has the ability to remove Governor Cook. Let's assume that some of your merits arguments are going to lose. They still have to show irreparable harm. So what's your best argument that he's suffering none?
Well, I think my best argument that he's not suffering irreparable harm in those circumstances is he's not suffering the unique indignity of having sort of pure executive power exercised by people that are removable at will outside of his control. And that maybe that's a little circular in the end, but I think it's kind of why this case is, I think, problematic for the government, because they could have come in here and said, Fed Schmed, it's not that different. This is just like the FTC, and so we're suffering the same irreparable injury as in those other cases. But when they come in and say, no, we're going to accept that the Fed is different, at least for purposes of this case, and that we can't remove somebody just for policy disagreements, then having somebody continuing in office just because you have a different conception of for cause than they do, or than you've been able to persuade a court so far about, doesn't strike me as irreparable harm. And then on the other side of the ledger, I think there are enormous irreparable harms here that really don't have an analog in most of these other situations. I don't mean to denigrate any other agency, but there's a reason that monetary policy has been treated differently for these many years, and there's a reason that the markets watch the Fed a little more closely than they watch really any other